Human helped an alien girl carry her water jar, only to learn why she walked that far alone. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. The heat shimmered above the cracked desert plain as Ethan Cole tightened the straps on his utility vest, dust lifting off his boots with every step. His scanner flickered in and out, protesting the dry static in the air, but he kept walking toward the damaged pipeline he was supposed to inspect before nightfall. The sun beat down like a furnace, and the wind carried the dry rasp of sand against metal. That was when he saw her. A small figure, barely more than a silhouette wobbling in the haze, trying to balance a ceramic water jar almost as big as her torso. Ethan slowed, blinking against the glare. At first he thought she was one of the settlement kids sneaking out again, but as she came into view he froze. She wasn't human. Her skin had a soft amethyst glow, catching light the way polished stone does, and her silver eyes were narrowed in determination as she leaned her entire body weight against the jar to keep it steady. She couldn't have been more than 14. The jar slipped a little, and she braced it with both arms, her breath catching. Ethan felt something tug in his chest. This was the middle of nowhere. The nearest shelter was miles behind him. What was a kid, alien or not, doing out here alone with a load like that? He jogged forward, raising a hand so he wouldn't startle her. Hey, you need a hand with that. She stiffened instantly, clutching the jar as if he'd threatened to take it. Up close, he saw her feet, bare, dusty, and clearly sore from walking. Her shoulders trembled under the jar's weight, but she shook her head anyway. I'm fine, she whispered, voice tight. Ethan knelt slightly to meet her eye level, keeping his hands visible. That thing weighs, what, 40 pounds? Let me help before it tips over. She hesitated, gripping the rim so tightly her knuckles paled to lavender. The wind kicked up a stinging veil of dust, and she flinched as grains swept across her face. Ethan stepped sideways, blocking most of the wind for her without touching either her or the jar. Look, I'm not trying to take it, he said gently. Just trying to make sure you don't drop it. That's a long way to carry water. Her eyes lifted to his, cautious but tired. The jar slipped again, just an inch, but enough for her breath to hitch in fear. Ethan reacted without thinking, sliding his hands under the heavy base before it could tilt. Got it, he murmured. She didn't pull away this time. She just let out a tiny, relieved breath, barely audible over the wind. Together, slowly, they began walking. Her steps were unsteady, but for the first time she didn't look like she was carrying the whole world alone. The wind softened as Ethan and the girl continued across the sand, the weight of the water jar steady in his hands while she kept one palm on the rim as if making sure it was still hers. The desert light shifted from harsh white to a warm amber, stretching their shadows long across the dunes. Ethan adjusted his grip, careful not to splash a drop. The ceramic was cool against his palms, which meant she had walked for hours before he found her. She stayed close but quiet, her steps shorter than his, her breathing shallow from exhaustion rather than fear now. After a minute she spoke, barely above a whisper. You should not help me. Ethan glanced down at her. Pretty sure I already am. She shook her head, silver hair catching the sunlight like strands of metal. If someone sees you, they will not like it. He did not answer right away. He let the wind fill the silence, sweeping thin trails of dust across the path they followed. Well, he finally said, I cannot let you drag this thing alone. It is heavier than you are. Her eyes flicked to him, unsure whether to argue or agree. The quiet stretched again, but this time it felt less tense. As they reached a ridge, Ethan lifted the jar slightly to keep the bottom from scraping a rock shelf. The girl slowed, staring out over the basin ahead. A dry riverbed twisted like a pale scar, and nestled at the far end, almost invisible from a distance, stood a small settlement of domes and tents made from woven fibers that shimmered faintly in the sun. She hesitated, and Ethan noticed how her posture shifted. Not fear, something like dread. Is that where you are headed? He asked. She nodded, folding her hands together, fingers tapping anxiously. It is my village. Ethan studied the cluster of structures. It was small, maybe 30 people at most, and there was no well tower, no water reclamation unit, not even a basic pump. "You came from all the way out here just for water?" he asked gently. She swallowed and looked at her feet. "It is what I am supposed to do." That answer sat wrong in his chest. A child should not be walking miles through desert heat with a jar that weighed nearly half her size. "Supposed to by who?" he asked, keeping his tone soft. She did not reply. She just tightened her grip on the jar's rim. They descended the ridge carefully, the sand giving under each step. Ethan matched his stride to hers, so she would not have to rush. At the bottom, a sharp gust blew grit across their ankles. The girl pressed closer to his side without thinking, then stepped away again as if she should not have done it. Ethan pretended not to notice, giving her space. The jar hummed lightly when the wind hit it, the sound resonant and hollow. Ethan realized she had protected it the entire journey, holding it like something fragile or precious. "What is your name?" he asked. She hesitated again, then answered softly. "Sarah." Ethan nodded once. "I am Ethan, and I am not letting you finish this walk alone." She looked up at him with a searching, almost bewildered expression, as if trying to understand why someone would say that so simply. The settlement grew clearer as they approached, and the air shifted cooler as shadows stretched over the path. Sarah's steps slowed the closer they came, and Ethan noticed how she kept glancing toward the village edge, the way a person might look toward a place that did not entirely welcome them. He adjusted the jar in his hands again, steadying her without touching her. The sun dipped lower, lighting the dunes in soft gold. Sarah's voice finally broke the quiet. "They will ask why you helped me." Ethan breathed in the warm, dusty air and let it out slowly. "Then I will tell them the truth," he said. "You needed help." She stared ahead, her expression unreadable, but there was something different in the way she walked now. Not lighter exactly, but not alone anymore. The closer Ethan and Sarah came to the village, the more the light seemed to shift, as if the air itself knew they were approaching a line that was not meant to be crossed. The low domes ahead glowed faintly under the setting sun, their woven surfaces catching the gold light in soft ripples. Sarah's pace slowed to almost a shuffle, and Ethan could feel her hesitation even without her saying a word. He adjusted the water jar carefully, the ceramic cool and steady against his palms, then glanced down at her. "Almost there," he said quietly. She nodded, but her eyes stayed fixed on the ground as if she wished it would swallow her tracks. A faint chime carried on the wind, soft and melodic, coming from somewhere deeper in the village. It sounded peaceful, but Sarah reacted as if it meant something else entirely. Her shoulders tightened, her breathing quickened just a little. Ethan lowered his voice. "You want me to walk behind you?" She looked up at him, startled by the offer, then shook her head. "No. If you go behind me, they will think I asked you to come." He raised an eyebrow. "Did you?" She pressed her lips together, unsure how to answer. They reached the first shadow cast by the outermost dome, and the temperature dropped a few degrees, enough for Ethan to notice the contrast on his skin. The wind quieted, replaced by the distant sound of murmurs, the soft movement of fabric, and the faint hum of something mechanical deeper inside the settlement. Sarah exhaled shakily. "You can leave now," she whispered. "I can finish from here." Ethan steadied the jar and gave her a look that was neither stern nor soft. "Sarah, your hands were shaking back there. I am carrying this the rest of the way. That is not up for debate." Her eyes widened, not in fear but disbelief, as if no one had told her. Something that directly kind in a long time. They moved forward together, their footsteps muffled by the packed sand. A few figures stood near one of the domes, their silhouettes still against the honey-colored light. Sarah immediately looked away, keeping her gaze down. Ethan noticed, but said nothing. He just shifted the jar closer to his chest, shielding it from a sudden gust of wind that rolled through the settlement's edge. "You do this every day?" he asked gently. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Every 2 days. Sometimes every day if the air is too dry." Ethan let that settle. She could barely carry the jar with both hands, and the path she walked had stretched for miles. "That is a long distance," he said. "Why does no one come with you?" Sarah swallowed, her silver eyes reflecting the soft orange glow of the domes. "Because it is not allowed for someone like me." Her voice was matter of fact, not angry, not resentful. Just the quiet acceptance of a rule she had lived under for as long as she could remember. a rule that weighed heavier than the water jar she clung to. Ethan slowed his steps, studying her face, then the village ahead. There was something unspoken in the way she held herself. Something that suggested she had learned to make herself small to fit into the thin spaces this place allowed her. "Well," he said softly, "I did not ask who allowed it. I asked why no one came with you." Syrah blinked, startled by the distinction. The last stretch toward the domes seemed to stretch on forever even though it was only a few yards. Shadows grew longer, reaching toward them like quiet reminders. Ethan kept his stride steady, lifting the jar slightly so Syrah did not have to push herself to match his pace. She glanced up at him again, uncertain, almost studying him. "Ethan," she whispered, "they are going to ask who you are." "Then I will tell them," he said simply, "that I was a guy who saw someone carrying too much alone." Syrah looked forward again, but her expression shifted. Not a smile. Something smaller and more fragile than that. Something that looked a little like hope. The first shapes of the villagers came into view as Ethan and Syrah stepped deeper into the settlement, their silhouettes shifting in the warm glow of lanterns that had just begun to flicker to life along the walkways. The soft hum of energy threads woven into the fabric domes vibrated faintly in the air, a calming sound for anyone who belonged here. Syrah's steps grew smaller the closer they came, her fingers brushing the side of the water jar, as if reassuring herself it was still in her possession. Ethan slowed just enough to let her set the pace. The path beneath them changed from loose sand to compact earth, marked by faint patterns pressed into the surface by years of footsteps. Syrah's eyes darted toward a group of villagers gathered near a central dome. They were speaking in low tones, their voices blending with the evening chime that echoed softly overhead. None of them noticed Ethan yet, but Syrah seemed to feel their presence like a weight. "We can take a different way," Ethan offered quietly. She shook her head. "There is only one place to return the water. They all see it." He nodded once, absorbing that without argument. This was not a place built around options. As they approached the group, the villagers gradually fell silent. Ethan could feel their attention settle on him, not harshly, but with a stillness that suggested surprise. Outsiders did not usually walk this deep into the settlement, especially not at dusk. One of the villagers, an older woman with pale, silver markings on her face, stepped slightly forward. Her eyes flicked from the water jar to Syrah, then to Ethan. Syrah lowered her head, almost hiding behind the curve of the jar Ethan carried. Before any words were exchanged, Ethan shifted his stance subtly, positioning himself so Syrah did not have to stand fully exposed to their gaze. Not shielding her, not challenging anyone, simply standing close enough to make her feel less alone. The older woman's expression softened just a degree when she saw Syrah's dust-covered feet and the way her hands trembled from the long walk. She addressed Syrah in her own language, the words musical and gentle, but Syrah only nodded tightly. Ethan could not understand the language, but he understood the tone. Concern, inquiry, maybe confusion. When the woman looked back to Ethan, he offered a respectful nod. "She walked a long way," he said quietly. "The jar was heavy. I only helped her carry it." The villagers murmured among themselves in hushed tones, their eyes moving between the girl and the human who had arrived with her. Syrah's fingers curled anxiously at her sides. Ethan leaned a little closer to her, lowering his voice. "You did well getting this far," he said. "Let us finish what we started." Slowly, Syrah guided him toward a smaller dome near the center of the settlement. It was simple, marked by a circular stone basin at its entrance. The moment they reached it, Ethan realized this was the place where the water was meant to be returned. Syrah touched the rim of the basin with a kind of reverence, as if performing a ritual she had memorized since childhood. Ethan lowered the jar carefully, keeping his movements steady and gentle. When the bottom touched the stone, Syrah released a breath so soft he barely heard it. She stepped forward, her hands moving over a small seal on the jar's lid. Her fingers shook, but she managed to open it, letting the faint scent of cool, clean water drift into the air. Ethan watched her pour just enough into a small vessel beside the basin, her movements precise and almost ceremonial. Only then did she speak, her voice barely more than air. "Thank you, Ethan." The way she said his name carried a depth that did not need explanation. He nodded once. "Any time." A faint glow from the basin lit her features in gentle shades of violet and silver. For the first time since he had met her, she did not look afraid of being seen. She just looked relieved, as if the simple act of not having to carry the weight alone, just this once, had shifted something inside her. The glow from the basin dimmed as Sira sealed the jar again, her hands lingering on the lid as if grounding herself after the long walk. The soft hum of the settlement surrounded them, steady and rhythmic, like a quiet heartbeat hidden beneath woven walls and evening lanterns. Ethan stepped back just enough to give her space, but stayed close enough for her to know he had not disappeared the moment the task was done. Sira glanced toward the center of the village where clusters of domes formed a loose circle. Warm light spilled from their entrances, casting soft lines across the sand. It should have looked inviting, but Sira stood rigid, as if the glow marked the boundary of a world she was allowed to step into only on certain terms. A faint breeze drifted through the settlement, carrying the scent of mineral dust and something floral from one of the drying racks nearby. Sira breathed it in slowly, letting her shoulders drop a fraction. Ethan watched her for a moment before speaking. "Do you need to take the jar inside?" She shook her head. "Not yet. I wait here." He looked around. "For what?" She opened her mouth, closed it again, then finally said, "For them to confirm I returned it correctly." The way she said "them" was soft, but there was something behind it. Not fear, more like a practiced acceptance. Ethan nodded, understanding more from her tone than her words. "All right, I will wait with you." Her eyes widened a little, as if that had not even been an option she considered. "You do not have to," she whispered. "I know," Ethan said. "I want to." Silence settled between them, but it was not uncomfortable. Not anymore. The desert trickled into dusk, the sky deepening into a gradient of lavender and gold. Sira shifted closer to the wall of the dome, lowering herself onto a small stone ledge. She tucked her knees slightly toward her chest, the position less nervous and more like someone trying to recover from a long, exhausting day. Ethan sat a short distance away, resting his forearms on his knees, letting the quiet fill the space. After a moment, Sira risked a glance at him. "Does your world have places like this?" she asked. Ethan considered the question. "Small towns. Sure. Quiet places, dusty places, places where everyone knows everyone else." She tilted her head, her silver eyes reflecting the low lantern light. "And children there, do they walk alone for water?" Ethan shook his head gently. "No, they do not." Sira absorbed that, her gaze drifting to the jar. The evening chime rang again, soft and melodic. This time it did not make her tense, but it did draw her attention toward a narrow path between two domes. Ethan followed her gaze. "Is someone supposed to meet you?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "They come to check the water level, and they make sure I did not spill any." Ethan kept his voice steady, neutral. "You did not spill any." "I know," she whispered, "but they have to say it." She traced a small pattern on the stone with her fingertip, a looping shape that repeated over and over, almost like a quiet attempt to calm herself. "If I spill, even a little," she said softly, "I have to go back again. Right away." Ethan felt something settle heavily in his chest, but he kept his expression gentle. "Sira," he said carefully, "that jar was too heavy for you even once." She looked at him with an expression that almost seemed apologetic. "It is the rule." A moment passed before she added, "Rules do not bend for someone like me." She did not say it with anger. She said it the way someone might state the color of the sky or the shape of a stone. Ethan let the silence sit, choosing not to challenge the rule she had lived under her whole life. Instead, he shifted slightly so that his shoulder aligned with hers, not touching, but close enough that she felt less alone in the cooling air. Lantern light glimmered across her amethyst skin, softening the exhaustion etched into her face. For the first time since he met her, she looked less like someone carrying a burden, and more like a kid who wanted, just for a moment, to rest without being watched. "If you have to wait," Ethan said quietly, "then I will wait with you." Sira blinked, surprised once again by the simplicity of his answer. She nodded slowly, and for the first time, her breath left her body in something that almost resembled ease. The evening deepened into a calm violet haze as Ethan and Sira waited beside the stone basin, the hum of the settlement softening into a quiet rhythm that blended with the cooling desert air. Lantern light shimmered against the woven walls around them, casting gentle patterns on the ground that shifted whenever the breeze moved. Sira kept her knees drawn slightly toward her chest, her fingers tracing slow, looping shapes on the edge of the ledge. Ethan could tell the small motions were less nervous now and more a way for her to steady her thoughts. A faint rustle came from the path between the domes, and Sira's posture straightened. Two villagers approached, their steps soft on the packed earth. They carried a small measuring tool made of curved metal, its surface reflecting the lantern light in pale gold flashes. The older villager from earlier offered Sira a nod, then began examining the jar with practiced calm. Sira watched silently, her expression unreadable, though Ethan sensed the tension beneath the quiet. The tool touched the water's surface with a soft chime, and the older villager murmured something gentle in their language. Sira's shoulders eased just slightly. The second villager dipped a thin rod into the jar, checking for purity. Another soft chime, then a quiet word of approval. When they turned to Ethan, their expressions held curiosity rather than hostility. The older villager gestured toward him with a questioning tilt of the head. Sira spoke before Ethan could. Her voice was soft but steady. He helped me carry it. I did not ask. The jar was too heavy. Ethan caught the small tremor in her voice near the end. The villagers exchanged a brief look, and something softened in their eyes. The older one bowed their head to Ethan, a gesture of formal thanks. Ethan returned the nod respectfully. No words needed. After the villagers left, Sira let out a slow breath, her fingers uncurling from where they had been gripping the stone. "It is done," she whispered. Ethan nodded. "Good." She looked up at him then, studying him with an intensity he did not expect. "You stayed the whole time," she said, as if confirming it for herself. "Of course I did," Ethan replied. "You should not have waited alone." Sira blinked, absorbing the simplicity of those words. She seemed unsure what to do with kindness delivered without condition. A soft breeze passed between them, carrying the faint scent of warm minerals and something sweet drifting from the nearby drying racks. Sira breathed it in, then settled her hands in her lap. "Ethan," she said quietly, "may I ask you something?" He nodded. "Anything." She hesitated, then continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why do you do this? Why help me? People here do not help me. They do not mean harm. They just do not see me." Ethan considered his answer, choosing his words with care. "I saw someone walking miles under the sun with a jar heavier than she should ever have to carry," he said. That was enough. Sira lowered her gaze, her silver eyes reflecting the lantern's glow with a quiet shimmer. "I did not think anyone would stop." "Well," Ethan said softly, "sometimes it only takes one person to break a pattern." The hum of the domes rippled through the air again, gentle and soothing. Sira leaned her shoulder back against the wall, her posture finally relaxing. The desert night settled fully now, the last strip of daylight fading into deep blue. A long silence stretched between them, but it felt warm, almost protective. Sira drew a small breath and whispered, "Ethan, thank you for seeing me." He looked at her, the lantern light catching the faint amethyst glow of her skin. "You are easy to see," he said simply. She did not answer, but the soft, fragile look in her eyes said enough. For the first time, she did not feel like a shadow moving along the edge of her own home. Tonight, she felt like someone who mattered. The night settled fully around the settlement, leaving the domes glowing like soft lanterns scattered across the sand. Ethan and Sira remained near the stone basin, the air turning cooler with each passing minute. The quiet felt different now, not tense or expectant, just steady, like the desert had finally exhaled after a long day. Sira shifted her feet slightly, brushing away a small line of sand with her heel. "You should return to your station soon," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "It is a long walk back." Ethan glanced toward the faint horizon where his equipment outpost lay hidden beyond the dunes. The walk would be long, but it was not what concerned him. "I will leave once you are settled," he replied. "I want to make sure you are all right for the night." She looked down as if the ground suddenly became very interesting. A warm light flickered along her cheekbones, reflecting off the amethyst hue of her skin. "I am used to nights alone," she murmured. Ethan studied her posture. She was not fragile, but there was a quiet resilience in her that came from doing too much alone for too long. Before he could respond, a soft sound interrupted them, light footsteps approaching from the side path. Sira straightened instantly. It was the older villager from earlier, carrying a small woven container shaped like a sphere. The villager offered a gentle nod to Sira, speaking a few melodic words in their native language, then extended the container toward her. Sira accepted it with both hands, her expression surprised. She waited until the villager disappeared around the curve of a dome before opening it just enough for Ethan to see inside. Soft bread wrapped in cloth, 2 small pieces of dried fruit, a tiny measure of a fragrant herb. Sira blinked, her voice barely audible. They have never brought this to me before. Ethan's tone was soft. Maybe they saw something different today. She closed the container gently, her fingers lingering on the lid. They saw you, she whispered. Ethan shook his head slightly. They saw someone helping you. That is the part that matters. Sira absorbed that quietly, her expression shifting in subtle ways. Relief, confusion, something almost like wonder. She looked toward the path leading to a smaller dome set slightly apart from the others. That is where I sleep, she said. The dome was small, tucked behind a row of drying racks, its entrance low and narrow. Ethan noticed how isolated it was compared to the others. Is it safe? He asked gently. Sira hesitated, then nodded. Yes, it is quiet and warm. She rose slowly, the woven container clutched to her chest. Ethan stood with her, dust shaking from his boots as he straightened. The night breeze curled between them, carrying the faint scent of drying herbs and warm sand. Sira took a step toward her dome, then stopped and turned back to him. Ethan, she said softly, today was different. Different how? She searched for the right words, her silver eyes reflecting the lanterns like small moons. Things felt less heavy, she whispered. The walk, the jar, the waiting, even being seen. It was still difficult, but it did not feel like I was carrying all of it alone. Ethan felt something steady settle in his chest, something warm that matched the quiet tone in her voice. You do not have to carry things alone, he said. Not anymore. Sira looked at him for a long moment. A delicate stillness settled in the space between them, as if the desert held its breath just to listen. Will you come back tomorrow? She finally asked. Her voice was careful, almost shy, like she was afraid she had asked for too much. Ethan nodded once, without hesitation. Yes, I will. Something softened in her expression, a small shift that felt brighter than the lanterns glowing across the village. She turned toward her dome, stepping slowly across the quiet path. Before she disappeared inside, she looked back at him one last time. There was no fear in her gaze now, only trust, and the fragile beginning of something like hope. The night deepened into a darker shade of blue by the time Ethan stepped onto the dunes again the next morning. The air carried the crisp coolness left behind by the fading night, and each footstep pressed soft marks into the sand as he made his way back toward the settlement. The horizon slowly brightened, painting the desert in soft sweeps of gold and rose. He carried a small pack slung over one shoulder, filled with basic supplies from his station, nothing grand. Just a few items he thought might help Sira with her long walks for water. As he approached the crest of the last dune, the settlement came into view, peaceful and quiet under the early sun. A few villagers were already awake, tending to drying racks or sweeping sand away from the walkways. Ethan spotted Sira near her small dome, kneeling beside a woven mat as she adjusted the straps of the water jar. The jar looked even larger in the morning light, almost comically oversized for her slender frame, yet she handled it with a familiarity that spoke of routine more than choice. Sira looked up when she sensed his presence, her silver eyes widening in a way that made the early sunlight seem brighter. She stood quickly, brushing sand from her hands. You came back, she said softly, as if confirming something delicate. Ethan nodded. I promised I would. Sira's fingers tapped lightly along the rim of the jar. I have to walk again today, she said, her voice steady but resigned. The water is low this morning. The air was dry last night. Ethan noticed the jar was already strapped to her back in preparation. He also noticed how her shoulders tilted slightly under the weight, the straps digging into her amethyst skin. Without a word, Ethan crouched and loosened one of the straps, adjusting it so it would not pull so sharply. Sira watched him quietly. Does that feel better? He asked. She nodded. Yes. Thank you. She paused, then added, Nobody has ever adjusted it for me before. Ethan secured the strap with a gentle tug. Well, there is a first time for everything. Sira held his gaze for a moment, then shifted her eyes toward the desert path. The sun will get hotter soon, she said. We should leave early. Ethan lifted the jar off her back before she could protest, holding it with practiced ease. I will carry it, he said simply. Sira looked startled. Ethan, they will ask why you took it. They will think I cannot do my task. Ethan shook his head. Your task is to bring water back, not to hurt yourself doing it. I can help. She hesitated, torn between rules and relief. Finally she whispered. Then, we walked together. They began across the sand, their steps slow but steady. The early light reflected off the desert floor, creating a shimmering path ahead. Sira kept close beside him, her smaller footprints pairing with his larger ones in a long trail behind them. For a while they walked in silence, listening to the gentle crunch of sand beneath their boots. Sira glanced toward the dunes, her voice soft. Ethan, she said, I used to think the walk was easier if I pretended I was invisible. If nobody saw me, then the weight felt lighter. Ethan shifted the jar slightly, finding a comfortable balance. And now, she looked up at him, her silver eyes bright and clear in the morning light. Now, she said, it feels lighter because someone sees me. The desert opened wide before them, but for the first time, Sira did not face it alone. The sun climbed slowly behind them, stretching their shadows long across the dunes, two shapes moving in quiet unison toward the distant well where Sira had always walked alone. Until today, the desert stretched wide and quiet as Ethan and Sira reached the far ridge overlooking the narrow canyon where the well hid beneath layers of rock. Morning light filtered into the canyon in soft gold beams, turning the stone walls warm and smooth like polished clay. Sira paused at the ridge, her breathing steady but her steps slowing as she looked down into the shaded path below. Ethan felt her hesitation before she said anything. It is always cold down there, she murmured, as if the memory of that chill had settled into her bones long ago. He adjusted the water jar in his arms, shifting the weight with practiced ease. Cold is a nice change from the sun, he said gently. A tiny smile flickered at the corner of her mouth. Together, they descended the winding path, the air cooling more with every step. Sira's fingers brushed the rock wall lightly, tracing faint grooves carved by years of travelers who had taken this same path. Ethan noticed how small her hand looked against the stone, and how confident her steps were despite the shadows. At the bottom of the canyon, the sound of water echoed softly, a steady dripping that felt almost musical in the enclosed space. Sira exhaled, a breath that carried a mixture of relief and memory. This is where I come every time, she said quietly. Nobody else walks this far. They use other sources closer to the village. Then why do you come here? Ethan asked. Sira hesitated, her silver eyes reflecting the dim light. Because the other wells are not for me, she said. This one is the only one I am allowed to use. Ethan let that sink in. The walk, the heat, the solitude, none of it had been a choice. Sira stepped toward the edge of the well, lifting the rope and bucket with practiced hands. Ethan moved beside her and set the jar gently on the ground. Together, they lowered the bucket, listening to the faint splash when it touched the water. As they waited for the bucket to fill, Sira spoke again. When I was younger, I used to think the walk was a test, she said softly. If I could carry the water home without spilling it, then maybe things would change. Ethan watched her expression. Did they? She shook her head once. No, but I kept hoping. The bucket surfaced, sloshing softly. Ethan lifted it without effort, pouring the cool water into the jar. A faint mist curled up from the mouth of the jar, catching the light. Sira watched him with an unreadable expression. Ethan, she said, you should not help me this much. If someone from the village sees, they might think I am not doing my part. Ethan placed the bucket down and wiped his hands on his pant leg. Doing your part should not mean carrying more than you can handle. Sira looked down, her fingers tightening around the rope. That is not how rules work, she whispered. Ethan studied the canyon walls, the well, the girl standing at its edge. Maybe the rules need someone to question them. Her eyes lifted too. His slowly, the silver catching the faint reflection of the water below. For a long moment, she said nothing, as if weighing the possibility of a world she had never dared to imagine. The jar was filled now, sealed and ready for the long walk back. Sira rested her palm against its cool surface before turning to Ethan. You cannot carry it the whole way, she said. People will notice. Ethan nodded, understanding. We will carry it together, he said. Half the time in my hands. Half the time in yours. Sierra blinked, startled by the compromise. That is not how it is supposed to be, she whispered. Maybe not, Ethan replied. But today, it is how we will do it. A quiet stillness settled between them, not heavy, but full, like something meaningful had clicked gently into place. Sierra stepped closer, her amethyst skin glowing faintly in the canyon's light. Ethan, she said softly, walking back will not feel the same as before. He looked at her, steady and calm. Good, he said. Sierra held his gaze for a long second before her voice dropped to a fragile whisper. Because now it does not feel like I walk alone. And as they began the climb back toward the sunlight, their shadows stretched upward together, one shape never leaving the side of the other.